the Great Pyramid does not simply stand on the Giza plateau. It waits. Rising from the desert like a frozen tide of stone, it overwhelms the horizon not through decoration or ornament, but through sheer presence. Its sheer scale bends the perception of time itself, making human effort seem insignificant, as though the monument were built not for men, but for eternity. No carvings announce its purpose. No inscriptions boast of its creator. No statues guard its entrance. Instead, it offers silence, heavy, deliberate, and unsettling. That silence has shaped generations of curiosity, wonder, and speculation. For centuries, scholars, travelers, and dreamers have attempted to break it, to extract meaning, yet the pyramid remains indifferent, as if aware that some truths are meant to challenge, not comfort. For generations, we have been told that this silence has already been explained. The story is familiar, comforting even. Around 2580 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, a pharaoh named Khufu commanded his people to build a tomb worthy of eternity. Tens of thousands of laborers quarried stone, hauled blocks across sand, and stacked them skyward using ramps, ropes, and relentless human effort. After 20 years, the monument was complete. A marvel of organization. A triumph of early civilization. Case closed. And yet, the closer one looks, the more that story begins to fracture. Because the Great Pyramid contains more than 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average over 2 tons. Some interior stones, particularly the granite beams above the king's chamber, weigh closer to 70 or even 80 tons. These massive stones were transported from Aswan, nearly 800 kilometers away, without the benefit of modern vehicles or cranes. The structure rises to nearly 147 meters and covers more than 13 acres, its base level to within centimeters across its entire footprint. Even by modern standards, such precision would be extraordinary. And yet, we are expected to believe this was accomplished with copper tools, wooden sleds, and human muscle alone. The problem is not that ancient people were incapable, human ingenuity has always astonished. The problem is that the evidence we rely on to support this narrative is astonishingly thin. There are no contemporary construction records from Khufu's reign. No papyrus scrolls detailing logistics, no wall reliefs showing the building process, no inventory lists of tools, no diagrams of ramps. In fact, for the largest stone structure ever built by humanity, the historical silence is almost total. There is no mention of worker rotations, no royal decrees about labor organization, no accounting of materials. And this silence is not subtle. It is deafening. So where does the story come from? Not from papyri or tombs, but from memory, through centuries of retelling, transformed into legend. It begins not in ancient Egypt, but in ancient Greece. Nearly 2,000 years after the pyramid was supposedly built, the historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BCE. He never witnessed the construction, nor could he. He relied entirely on what priests told him, stories passed down orally for centuries. Herodotus recorded tales of massive labor forces, long construction periods, and stone hauled by ramps. But he also recorded other things. He spoke of strange machines, of sacred knowledge, of stones raised in ways that bordered on the miraculous. These details rarely survive in modern textbooks. We extract the parts that feel reasonable and quietly discard the rest. Herodotus was not a fraud. He was a collector of stories, a traveler guided by curiosity, and a chronicler of marvels. Part historian, part myth keeper, part adventurer, he transcribed what he was told, often without understanding the technology or methods described. Yet modern Egyptology leans heavily on his second-hand account, choosing selectively which details to believe. Those that fit neatly into a timeline of human progress are retained. Those that suggest lost knowledge, advanced techniques, or extraordinary engineering are minimized or explained away. In this selective reading, the foundation of the Great Pyramid story begins to appear less certain, more a patchwork of assumption than fact. Fast forward to the 19th century, when European powers transformed Egypt into a playground for ambition and personal glory. Archaeology was not yet a science, it was conquest with notebooks. Explosives were tools. Speed mattered more than preservation. Fame was the real treasure. Among these figures was a British officer named Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse. Vyse was not trained in archaeology. He was trained in command, in strategy, and in getting results. And he wanted a discovery that would secure his legacy. He was a man of impatience and grandiose vision, one who believed that history would not reveal itself to the hesitant or the timid. When patience failed him, Vyse turned to gunpowder. In 1837, he began blasting his way through the Great Pyramid, shattering passages that had remained sealed for millennia. Granite cracked. Dust-filled chambers that had not breathed air since antiquity. The explosions echoed, bouncing off stone corridors in a chorus of destruction. Egyptian workers watched in disbelief and horror as centuries of silence were shattered in minutes. This was not careful exploration. This was conquest. Vyse believed that the end justified the means, that history could be carved, or blasted, into existence. Then, Vyse announced his triumph. Above the king's chamber, in a series of narrow spaces now called the relieving chambers, red-painted markings were discovered on granite beams. Rough hieroglyphs. Quarry marks. And most importantly, a royal cartouche bearing the name Khufu. This, Vyse declared, was the builder's signature. At last, proof. Textbooks were rewritten. Doubt dissolved. The pyramid had an owner. Egyptology, finally, had something solid to stand on. Yet science does not work by comfort. It works by scrutiny. And when scholars began to examine those red markings more closely, troubling details emerged. The symbols were painted, not carved. Unlike the finely chiseled hieroglyphs found in royal tombs, these marks looked rushed, almost careless, as though someone had been more concerned with speed than accuracy. Some symbols were misspelled. Others used forms that did not exist during Khufu's reign. Perhaps most strikingly, identical errors appeared in a 19th-century hieroglyphic reference book, one that Vyse himself owned. The coincidence is too convenient to ignore. Chemical analysis raised further questions. The red ochre pigment lacked the micro-cracking and mineral degradation expected of paint thousands of years old. Under magnification, the pigment appeared to sit on top of quarry marks rather than beneath accumulated dust layers. If authentic, the paint should have been buried by time, not gleaming, almost defiant, in the narrow chambers above the king's chamber. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the cartouche appears only in Vyse's later notes. Early field journals from his assistants make no mention of it. The signature that supposedly solved the mystery arrived suspiciously late, when Vyse was running out of money, time, and reputation. If those markings are not authentic, then the Great Pyramid suddenly becomes unmoored from history. Without Khufu's name, the monument floats in time, undated, anonymous, defiant. And that possibility terrifies orthodoxy. Because if the Great Pyramid cannot be securely placed within Egypt's dynastic timeline, then every assumption built upon it begins to wobble. The engineering, the technology, the cultural sequence. All of it depends on a few strokes of red paint applied in a chamber opened with explosives. The stones themselves, however, tell a different story. Erosion patterns along the pyramid's base and the nearby Sphinx enclosure suggest prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Not the occasional desert storm, but sustained precipitation. Geological studies show that such rainfall ended thousands of years before Khufu, during a much wetter climatic period when the Sahara was green and rivers flowed where today there is only sand. Vertical channels carved into limestone walls point to water runoff, not wind erosion. Nature, it seems, left its own timestamp, one that does not align with accepted history. Yet these clues are often dismissed, minimized, or reinterpreted to preserve the narrative. Why? Because the alternative is unsettling. To question the pyramid's age is to question civilization itself. It forces us to confront the possibility that advanced knowledge existed before recorded history and was later forgotten. That the ancient world may have contained technological or organizational capabilities far beyond what we currently credit it with. The Great Pyramid does not shout this truth. It whispers it. Patiently. Indifferently. And it begins with absence. The absence of proof. The absence of certainty. The absence of a builder's hand. That silence is not empty. It is loaded. Every shadowed corridor, every misplaced stone, every unexplained channel or chamber may be carrying messages the world has yet to read. And in the next part, we will step back into the blasted chambers above the king's chamber, reopen Colonel Vai's discovery, and examine it not as tradition demands, but as evidence allows. Because if the cornerstone of Egyptology rests on a Victorian forgery, then history itself may need to be rewritten. If the name of Khufu was painted onto the pyramid thousands of years after it was built, then the monument is no longer simply a tomb, it is a message from a lost age. A challenge from the past, waiting for those brave enough to question what they were taught, and listen to the whispers that have been ignored for centuries. In Part 2, we investigate the man who may have changed history with a paintbrush, and the scandal that archaeology still avoids. Every historical narrative has a weak point. A hinge on which everything turns. For the Great Pyramid, that hinge is not a stone block, not a ramp, not a tool, but a handful of red-painted symbols, hidden high above the king's chamber, discovered in 1837 by a man desperate to be remembered. These marks were small, almost laughably insignificant, yet their presence, or absence, could rewrite the story of one of humanity's most enigmatic monuments. To understand why these markings matter so much, we must first understand the man who found them. Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse was not an academic. He had no formal training in Egyptology, archaeology, or historical scholarship. He was, instead, a retired British military officer, wealthy enough to fund his own expeditions, ambitious enough to risk everything for recognition, and impatient enough to believe that history could be shaped as much by willpower as by fact. In the early 19th century, Egypt was not just a land of antiquity, it was a battlefield of reputations. Every newly unearthed tomb, statue, or inscription was a weapon. Discoveries meant fame. Fame meant immortality. And immortality, Vyse believed, was worth almost any compromise. Vyse arrived at Giza already frustrated. Another explorer, Giovanni Caviglia, had beaten him to the site and earned local support through patience and methodical work. Caviglia was meticulous. He measured, he documented, he respected the fragile remnants of millennia. Vyse saw this not as scholarship but as cowardice. In his mind, the slow methods of academics were obstacles, delaying the moment when the pyramids would yield their secrets. So he did what soldiers do. He seized control. Using a combination of money, political pressure, and sheer force, Vyse pushed Caviglia out and claimed the pyramid complex for himself. Where others excavated, Vyse blasted. Gunpowder became his primary instrument. Walls that had stood intact for thousands of years were shattered in minutes, ancient dust clouds billowing like smoke from a battlefield. In his own journals, he describes explosions echoing through the pyramid's interior, stone cracking, and debris cascading in chaotic showers. Modern archaeologists would call this vandalism. Vyse called it progress. There was a thrill in destruction, a sense of dramatic purpose. He believed that history belonged to those bold enough to wrest it from the past. Weeks passed. Then months. And still, nothing. No inscriptions. No treasures. No proof. His funds began to dwindle. His reputation among fellow explorers deteriorated. Newspapers that had once celebrated his audacity now questioned his methods. The pyramid, magnificent and silent, refused to yield its secrets. And Vyse, who had entered Egypt with the swagger of a conqueror, began to feel the icy touch of desperation. Then, in late March of 1837, everything changed. Vyse's men breached a series of narrow chambers above the king's chamber, spaces now known as the relieving chambers. These were not living spaces, not ceremonial halls, not places of honor. They were structural cavities, engineered to redistribute the immense weight of the stones above, a feat of architectural ingenuity designed to prevent collapse. And inside these unassuming chambers, faint red markings appeared. Rough symbols, construction lines, and, most importantly, a cartouche. A cartouche is no ordinary symbol. Encircled in an oval ring, it represents the name of a pharaoh, a royal signature meant to declare ownership, power, and legitimacy. Vai's discovery seemed to confirm what had long been assumed but never proven: the Great Pyramid belonged to Khufu, one of Egypt's most enigmatic rulers. Newspapers celebrated him. Scholars embraced the find. At last, the greatest monument in human history had a definitive author. Yet from the very beginning, something felt wrong. Ancient Egyptian royal inscriptions were typically carved, not painted, especially on monuments of supreme importance. Paint fades. Stone endures. Yet these markings were applied hastily, unevenly, almost like graffiti rather than a formal declaration. More troubling were the errors. Some hieroglyphs were misspelled. Others used forms that did not exist during Khufu's reign. One symbol, in particular, employed a later spelling of the pharaoh's name, strikingly similar to the version published in a British reference book just decades earlier. A book that Vise owned. Under microscopic examination, the red ochre pigment revealed further anomalies. It showed none of the chemical breakdown expected over for millennia. Instead, it appeared unnaturally vibrant, almost as if freshly painted. Worse, the pigment sat atop quarry marks, lines and scratches made when the stones were first cut and positioned, indicating it was applied after the stones were already in place. If the markings were genuine, they should have been sealed beneath centuries of dust and patina, not boldly staring back at the modern world. The circumstances surrounding the discovery added to the suspicion. Vai's assistants, men who entered the chambers first, made no clear mention of the cartouche in their initial notes. The first detailed descriptions appear only later, in Vai's own writings, after disputes with his foreman and mounting pressure to produce results. A pattern emerged: desperation, opportunity, convenience. All the ingredients necessary for embellishment, or worse, deliberate forgery. Was it a forgery? Intent is impossible to prove beyond doubt. Vise was, after all, a man with the means, motive, and opportunity to fabricate a discovery. But history is rarely a courtroom. It is an investigation of probabilities. And in this case, the probabilities were uncomfortable. If Vise fabricated or exaggerated those markings, then the single strongest piece of evidence linking the Great Pyramid to Khufu collapses. And with it collapses the chronological framework upon which much of Egyptology rests. Because outside of those red symbols, Khufu's connection to the pyramid is almost shockingly thin. No construction records exist from his reign. No wall reliefs depict the building process. No papyrus mentions the monument. Even Khufu's own statue, discovered at Abydos, is barely 10 centimeters tall, the smallest representation of any major pharaoh. For a ruler capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers to erect the largest stone structure in history, the archaeological silence is deafening. Scholars have offered explanations: tradition, humility before the gods, restraint in the face of divine authority. But these answers falter under scrutiny. Later pharaohs, building smaller pyramids, left behind rich inscriptions, elaborate wall reliefs, and extensive texts detailing their achievements. If humility explains Khufu's silence, it must have been an extraordinary virtue, or a veil to hide secrets we are yet to uncover. As doubt spread among independent researchers, mainstream Egyptology doubled down. To question Vise's discovery was to threaten an entire discipline. Careers, textbooks, museum exhibits, all leaned heavily on that red cartouche. And yet, anomalies persisted. Chemical tests conducted in the late 20th century revealed traces of industrial iron oxide in the pigment, a material consistent with 19th century paint. Digital imaging uncovered brush fibers embedded in the paint, unlike any tools known to the ancient Egyptians. Requests for further sampling were denied. Preservation, officials said, must take precedence. Yet preservation can sometimes mean protecting a narrative rather than a monument. If those markings are indeed younger than the pyramid itself, the implications are staggering. The structure becomes undated. Its builder uncertain. Its era unconfirmed. And if Khufu did not build it, if the supposed signature is a mirage, then the very foundations of history wobble. Who then commanded the labor, designed the geometry, and orchestrated a project that would dwarf all that came before it? And why have we been told that the answer is Khufu, based on nothing more than a possibly fabricated smear of red paint? Even science, which prides itself on objectivity, struggles to provide certainty. Carbon dating, geological analysis, and architectural study can estimate materials' ages, but they cannot yet fully resolve a question so entangled with human ambition, forgery, and historical bias. If the Great Pyramid's only signature is a questionable smear, then time itself becomes the next witness, capable of judgment, yet frustratingly silent. The story of the Great Pyramid, then, is not just the story of stone and labor. It is the story of human desire, the desire to be remembered, the desire to conquer time, the desire to claim glory. Vi's red cartouche is more than a mark on granite, it is a mirror reflecting the ambitions, flaws, and failings of those who study history. And it raises a haunting question: what else might we accept as fact, simply because it was convenient, celebrated, or politically expedient to believe it? Because the Great Pyramid refuses to be silent. Every stone, every angle, every chamber whispers questions we have not yet learned to listen to. And if we listen carefully, we realize that history itself is as fragile as the red pigment on those granite beams, ready to crumble under scrutiny, revealing truths more complex and unsettling than any legend or textbook could contain. And so, even as we trace the hand of Khufu, even as textbooks assert his authorship, we must ask ourselves, are we tracing history or the ambitions of a man desperate to make his mark? Only by confronting this uncomfortable possibility can we hope to understand the true story behind one of the world's greatest mysteries. Even today, the Great Pyramid continues to challenge us, not just with its engineering marvels, but with the fragile, enigmatic evidence that attempts to tie it to a single human hand. For if Khufu did not build it, then the question of its origin opens a labyrinth of possibilities, each more intriguing and disturbing than the last. And before we can even begin to answer that, we must first confront the uncomfortable truth about the red cartouche and the man who may have painted it. Because the hinge of history is fragile. And sometimes, it turns on something as small, as subtle, and as dangerous as a smear of red paint. Dating a stone monument sounds simple, until you actually try. Stone does not rot like wood. It does not decompose like flesh. It does not absorb time the way organic matter does. To science, stone is stubbornly mute. It carries no internal clock, no natural decay rate, no chemical countdown that reveals when it was shaped or placed. And the Great Pyramid, composed almost entirely of stone, is the most silent witness of all. For decades, archaeologists have tried to make it speak by indirect means, by association, by assumption, by fragments found nearby rather than by the monument itself. Each attempt was designed to reinforce an already accepted timeline, not to question it. Yet with every new test, the pyramid resisted conformity. Instead of clarity, it produced contradictions. Instead of confirmation, it generated discomfort. The first major attempt to scientifically anchor the Great Pyramid in time came in the 1980s, when teams funded by private research foundations conducted radiocarbon dating on mortar samples extracted from various points in the structure. Mortar, unlike stone, contains organic material, charcoal from fires, plant fibers, bits of straw, that can be carbon dated. On the surface, this seemed like a breakthrough. Initial results appeared to support the orthodox view. Many samples clustered around 2500 BCE, aligning neatly with the reign of Pharaoh Khufu of the 4th dynasty. Egyptology celebrated quietly. Headlines reassured the public. The case, it seemed, was closed. But science does not end with first impressions. When researchers examined the full dataset, cracks appeared. The dates did not agree with one another. Some samples were centuries older than Khufu. Others were centuries younger. One sample suggested a date approaching 3000 BCE, long before Khufu's birth, before the 4th dynasty, before Egypt itself was supposedly capable of such construction. The explanation came swiftly and confidently: the old wood theory. Builders, it was said, reused older organic material. Charcoal from ancient trees. Recycled plant fibers. Old wood burns the same as new wood, and its carbon clock begins ticking when the tree dies, not when the mortar is mixed. It was a tidy answer. Too tidy. Because it solved every anomaly without actually explaining any of them. More importantly, it overlooked a critical flaw: mortar does not date construction. It dates repair. Over thousands of years, the Great Pyramid has been opened, sealed, repaired, and restored countless times. Stones were reset after earthquakes. Cracks were filled. Gaps were patched. Mortar was added, removed, and replaced. Radiocarbon dating measures the age of organic material, not the age of the stone it adheres to. Dating pyramid mortar is like dating the paint on a wall and claiming it proves when the building was erected. It tells you when someone last touched it, not when it was born. Later studies made the situation worse, not better. In the 1990s, Swiss researchers conducted independent radiocarbon tests on additional samples. Their results showed discrepancies of up to 1,000 years between different mortar fragments. Some dates extended far beyond the accepted dynastic timeline. Instead of triggering deeper investigation, access to new samples was restricted. Requests were denied. Preservation was cited again. Yet preservation had not stopped early explorers from blasting passages with gunpowder or stripping the pyramid of its casing stones. It only became urgent when the data became inconvenient. Then, in 2020, history intervened, not through a planned excavation or official announcement, but through accident. In a quiet Scottish museum, a curator sorting through forgotten storage boxes came across a small wooden fragment wrapped in old, yellowed newspaper. The label was handwritten, fading but legible: Great Pyramid, Dixon Relic. This was no ordinary piece of wood. In 1872, British engineer Wayman Dixon had explored one of the pyramid's narrow, hidden shafts, passages so inaccessible they could not have served ritual or symbolic purposes. Inside, he discovered 3 objects sealed within the structure itself: a granite sphere, a bronze hook, and a small piece of cedar wood. The stone ball and hook were catalogued and displayed. The wood vanished into storage, misplaced for nearly 150 years. Until now. When the fragment was finally subjected to radiocarbon dating, the results stunned researchers. The wood dated to approximately 3500 to 3400 BCE. 5 to 8 centuries older than Khufu. Older than the first recognized dynasties of Egypt. Older than the timeline that Egyptology depends upon. This was not mortar. This was not repair material. This was an object embedded within the pyramid's internal architecture. The pyramid had finally spoken, and it spoke in a voice older than expected. The response was immediate and defensive. Trees can live hundreds of years, critics argued. The wood may have been old when it was used. Contamination was suggested. Statistical margins were debated. But the fact remained: this was the only organic artifact ever found sealed inside the pyramid's original structure, and it pointed firmly backward in time. Even if the wood were reused, its presence inside a hidden shaft suggested knowledge, planning, and access that predated Khufu's reign. The stone itself added another layer of testimony. Geology does not lie, and it does not care about academic consensus. The lower courses of the Great Pyramid and the surrounding Giza Plateau display erosion patterns inconsistent with Egypt's desert climate. Vertical channels carved deep into the limestone indicate prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Wind erosion scours horizontally. Sand abrades surfaces evenly. Only water, sustained, seasonal rainfall, cut stone vertically. Egypt has not experienced such rainfall since the end of the last ice age, between 700 and 5000 BCE. The nearby Sphinx enclosure exhibits identical erosion signatures, leading some geologists to argue that the Sphinx, and possibly the pyramid complex itself, predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. Sediment cores extracted from the Nile Valley confirm this wetter climate phase. During that time, the Sahara was green. Rivers flowed where deserts now stand. Human populations were larger, more settled, and more complex than traditionally acknowledged. If the pyramid's base was exposed to those rains, then its lower layers must have existed during that period. Stone remembers what humans forget. The implications are staggering. If the Great Pyramid is older than writing, older than dynasties, older than kings, then history does not begin where we were taught it does. Some researchers attempt to compromise theory that the pyramid was built in stages. An ancient core, constructed by an unknown civilization, later refurbished and claimed by dynastic Egyptians. Khufu may not have built it, but he may have restored it, inscribed it, and taken ownership of it. This idea is not radical when viewed through Egyptian tradition. Later pharaohs routinely usurped monuments, carving their names over earlier ones, erasing predecessors from memory. Temples were repurposed. Statues were rebranded. Even gods were renamed. Power was inherited by appropriation. Why would the greatest monument of all be exempt? The Great Pyramid may not belong to a single era at all. It may be a palimpsest of stone, a monument written, rewritten, and claimed across millennia. A structure whose true origins were already ancient by the time Egypt emerged from prehistory. And if that is true, then the final question becomes unavoidable. If it was not built by dynastic Egyptians, if it predates known civilization, then how was it built? Because the deeper we push its origins into the past, the more impossible its construction becomes. Stone weighing tens of tons. Precision measured in fractions of a degree. Alignment to true north with accuracy modern instruments struggle to match. No wheels. No iron. No written records. No surviving tools capable of the task. This question does not merely challenge history, it threatens it. Because if the Great Pyramid is older than Egypt itself, then its builders possessed knowledge that was lost, erased, or deliberately forgotten. Knowledge that does not fit comfortably within our linear story of progress. And that realization changes everything. In Part 4, we confront the impossible engineering of the Great Pyramid and discover why even today, with all our technology, we still struggle to explain how it was done. Imagine standing on the Giza Plateau thousands of years ago. The sun beats down mercilessly. Sand stretches endlessly in every direction. There are no engines. No steel cranes. No electricity. No precision instruments. Only stone, wood, rope, and human muscle. Now imagine trying to build the Great Pyramid. Not a rough monument. Not a symbolic mound. But a structure so precise that it rivals modern engineering. This is where the orthodox story begins to unravel completely. The Great Pyramid is not simply large. It is mathematically extreme. It originally stood at approximately 146.6 meters tall. Its base covers more than 13 acres. Each side measures about 230.4 meters, and the difference between the longest and shortest sides is less than 2 centimeters. Let that sink in. Across a footprint larger than several football fields, the builders achieved a level of accuracy that modern construction companies struggle to replicate even with lasers, GPS, and computer modeling. The pyramid's base is level to within 1.5 centimeters across its entire span. Its sides are aligned to true north with an error of only 3 arc minutes, about 0.05 degrees. That is more accurate than many modern observatories. Even the Hubble Space Telescope, assembled with cutting-edge technology, has comparable tolerance margins. How does a Bronze Age society achieve this? The accepted answer is simple tools and extraordinary organization. But when engineers translate that idea into real physics, the numbers collapse under their own weight. To complete the pyramid in the commonly cited 20 years, builders would have had to quarry, transport, shape, lift, and place roughly 2.3 million stone blocks. That works out to setting one block every 2 minutes, day and night, without pause, for 2 decades. No modern construction project operates at that speed. And this assumes perfect conditions, no mistakes, no weather delays, no injuries, no structural failures. Now consider the materials. The majority of the pyramid is limestone, quarried locally. But the internal chambers, the king's chamber, the relieving chambers, and key passages are constructed from Aswan granite, one of the hardest stones on Earth. Granite ranks 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Copper, the hardest metal supposedly available to 4th dynasty Egyptians, ranks 3. In modern laboratory tests, copper chisels barely scratch granite before bending or dulling. Experimental archaeologists have tried repeatedly to replicate ancient cutting techniques using copper tools and sand abrasives. The results are consistent. They fail. Dennis Stocks, one of the most respected experimental archaeologists, managed to cut shallow grooves into limestone after hours of labor. Against granite, copper tools were essentially useless. Yet inside the Great Pyramid are granite blocks weighing up to 80 tons, shaped with astonishing precision. Some granite beams are flat to within fractions of a millimeter. Corners meet at perfect right angles. Surfaces are smooth enough to reflect light evenly. To shape just one such block using copper chisels would require months, perhaps years, of continuous labor. Multiply that by hundreds, and the timeline becomes impossible. And shaping is only part of the problem. Transportation is worse. The granite used in the pyramid came from Aswan, nearly 800 kilometers south of Giza. The Nile likely served as a transport route, but physics imposes limits. Modern naval engineers have calculated the buoyancy limits of wooden barges based on ancient designs. A barge capable of carrying a 60-ton granite block would sit dangerously low in the water. When tested in modern reconstructions, such vessels often crack or sink under the load. Even if the stones reached Giza intact, they still had to be hauled uphill from the riverbank to the plateau. This brings us to ramps, the most common explanation offered by Egyptology. Straight ramps long enough to achieve a workable incline would have stretched more than a kilometer and required more material than the pyramid itself. Spiral ramps wrapping around the exterior would block sightlines, making precise alignment impossible. Yet no trace of these massive ramp systems has ever been found. No foundations. No debris fields. No quarry scars corresponding to ramp construction. The ramps simply vanish from the archaeological record. In 1978, a Japanese team sponsored by Nippon Television attempted to test the orthodox theory. Working with Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, they tried to build a 20-meter-tall pyramid using only tools and techniques believed available to the ancient Egyptians. The experiment was a failure. Copper tools broke. Ropes snapped. Stones refused to move efficiently across sand. Workers resorted to water lubrication to reduce friction, an ancient technique depicted in wall paintings, but even then progress was painfully slow. Eventually, the team abandoned ancient methods entirely and used modern steel tools and cranes. Even so, they reached only half their intended height before giving up. Their final report was diplomatic, but devastating. Ancient techniques could not account for the speed, scale, or precision of the Great Pyramid. Then there are the tool marks. At the Aswan quarries, massive granite blocks remain partially extracted from bedrock. On their surfaces are circular grooves and straight channels that resemble drill holes. When engineers examined these grooves under magnification, they notice spiral striations, helical patterns consistent with a rotating cutting tool. Not hammering. Not pounding. But drilling. Engineer Christopher Dunn, a precision manufacturing specialist, analyzed these marks and calculated the feed rate of the tool, the speed at which it advanced through stone. The results were shocking. The feed rate was equivalent to a drill operating at thousands of revolutions per minute, applying pressure far beyond what human hands could produce. In modern industry, similar marks are created by diamond-tipped drills or ultrasonic machining, technologies developed in the 20th century. No experiment using copper tubes and sand has ever successfully reproduced those patterns. And the precision doesn't stop at cutting. Inside the Great Pyramid, blocks fit together so tightly that even a razor blade cannot slide between them. The casing stones, most now removed, were polished to near optical flatness. French engineers studying surviving casing blocks described tolerances comparable to precision-machined metal. One engineer famously remarked that the pyramid exhibits the accuracy of an airplane wing applied to millions of tons of stone. Then there is the foundation. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that the pyramid sits on a carefully prepared base of interlocking bedrock terraces. These terraces distribute weight evenly, preventing settlement. After thousands of years of earthquakes, sandstorms, and thermal expansion, the pyramid has shifted only millimeters. Modern engineers use finite element modeling software to achieve similar stability. So how did ancient builders do it? The paradox deepens when we consider history's direction. Technological progress usually moves from crude to refined. Early attempts are rough. Later ones improve. But in Egypt, the pattern is reversed. The oldest pyramid is the most precise. Later pyramids are smaller, less accurate, more structurally flawed. Mistakes increase over time. This suggests not experimentation, but decline. Inheritance rather than invention. Some researchers propose that the pyramid's builders used techniques now lost. Others suggest advanced surveying methods based on stellar observation or Earth geometry. But even these explanations fall short. Surveying alone cannot cut granite. Astronomy alone cannot lift 80-ton blocks. Organization alone cannot overcome material limits. So alternative theories emerge. Some suggest stone was cast using a lost form of limestone geopolymer, an ancient concrete. While this may explain some outer blocks, it fails to account for the granite interiors. Others propose that vibration, sound, or resonance played a role in shaping or moving stone. In modern laboratories, ultrasonic cutting can slice granite effortlessly. The idea sounds radical, but so does the pyramid itself. Acoustic tests inside the king's chamber reveal that it resonates at specific frequencies. When sound is introduced, the granite vibrates like a colossal tuning fork. Quartz-rich granite exhibits piezoelectric properties. It generates electrical charge under stress or vibration. Combined with limestone insulation, the pyramid resembles a massive resonant cavity. Was this intentional? We don't know. But every measurement suggests purpose, not accident. The Great Pyramid is not sloppy genius. It is disciplined precision. And that precision should not exist, at least, not according to conventional history. If the builders lacked advanced tools, then they possessed advanced knowledge. If they lacked advanced knowledge, then they possessed advanced technology. Either way, the orthodox explanation collapses. And this brings us to a haunting possibility. What if the Great Pyramid was not built by trial and error, but by a civilization already at the peak of its understanding? A civilization whose tools, methods, and records were lost long before Egypt's dynasties rose from the Nile. Because the pyramid does not look like the beginning of architecture. It looks like the end of something. If the Great Pyramid's engineering exceeds the limits of ancient technology, then the next mystery becomes unavoidable. How did its builders see, measure, and work in complete darkness, without fire, without smoke, and without leaving a trace? In Part 5, we enter the pyramid's lightless heart and confront a problem no textbook can solve. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, there is a problem so simple, so obvious, that it is often overlooked. There is no light. No windows. No vents. No soot. Yet the interior passages and chambers, some of them carved from solid granite, were shaped, aligned, and finished with extraordinary precision. The question is unavoidable: how did they see what they were doing? In the ancient world, light meant fire. Torches. Oil lamps. Wick soaked in animal fat. And fire leaves traces. Soot clings to ceilings. Smoke stains walls. Carbon embeds itself into stone pores. Archaeologists find these marks everywhere, in tombs, temples, caves, and mines across the ancient world. Everywhere, that is, except inside the Great Pyramid. The walls of the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, and the long ascending passages are remarkably clean. No blackened ceilings. No smoke residue. No carbon build-up. Not even microscopic traces. This absence is not subtle. It is absolute. Egyptologists have attempted to explain this away. Some suggest mirrors were used to reflect sunlight deep into the structure. Others propose short work periods with constant cleaning. A few argue that soot simply eroded over time. But none of these explanations survive close examination. Let's start with mirrors. Ancient Egyptians did possess mirrors, but they were made of polished copper or bronze. These surfaces tarnish quickly, reducing reflectivity. Even when perfectly polished, their reflectivity is far lower than modern glass mirrors. Now imagine trying to bounce sunlight through multiple angled passages, around corners, and into enclosed chambers dozens of meters inside a stone mountain. Each reflection loses intensity. After just a few bounces, the light would be barely visible, certainly not bright enough to carve granite with millimeter precision. Experiments have been conducted. They fail. Even with modern reflective materials, illuminating the king's chamber using reflected sunlight is nearly impossible. With ancient mirrors, it becomes fantasy. What about lamps? Oil lamps burn. They smoke. Even the cleanest ancient fuels leave carbon residue. In tombs where lamps were used briefly, soot is still visible thousands of years later. Yet the Great Pyramid ceilings remain pristine. Some argue that the chambers were cleaned afterward. But cleaning granite without modern solvents would be nearly impossible. More importantly, why clean something no one was meant to see again? The chambers were sealed. If this was a tomb, the workspaces would never be revisited. There would be no reason to erase evidence of construction. And yet the evidence is gone. Then there is the oxygen problem. Burning lamps consume oxygen rapidly. In confined spaces, this becomes dangerous. Modern safety standards require ventilation even for brief work in enclosed areas. The Great Pyramid has no ventilation shafts large enough to support prolonged combustion. The so-called air shafts are narrow, angled, and sealed at one end, hardly suitable for airflow. So how did workers breathe? How did they see? How did they work for years inside sealed stone corridors without smoke, without suffocation, without leaving a trace? The simplest answer is also the most unsettling. They did not use fire. Which leads to a radical question: what kind of light leaves no residue? Modern science offers a few possibilities. Electric light leaves no soot. Chemical luminescence leaves no carbon traces. Plasma-based light leaves none. But electricity, we are told, did not exist in ancient times. Or did it? In the 1930s, archaeologists uncovered a curious artifact near Baghdad. A small clay jar, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, sealed with asphalt. When filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, the device produces a measurable electrical current. It became known as the Baghdad battery. Mainstream scholars argue it may have been used for electroplating, coating objects with metal. Experiments confirm this is possible. If ancient cultures understood electrochemistry well enough to generate electricity, even at low levels, then electric illumination is no longer unthinkable. But the Great Pyramid may hint at something even more advanced. Consider its materials. The pyramid is built primarily from limestone, an excellent electrical insulator. The king's chamber, however, is constructed entirely from granite, rich in quartz. Quartz exhibits piezoelectric properties. When stressed or vibrated, it generates an electrical charge. When subjected to an electric field, it vibrates. Now add geometry. The pyramid shape concentrates stress and vibration toward its center. Earth itself vibrates constantly, seismic microtremors, tectonic shifts, resonance from atmospheric activity. Recent acoustic experiments inside the pyramid have shown that certain chambers resonate strongly at specific frequencies. When sound waves are introduced, energy becomes trapped, amplified, and focused. The pyramid behaves less like a tomb and more like a resonant device. Some researchers propose that the structure functioned as a kind of energy system, harvesting natural vibrations, converting mechanical stress into electrical phenomena through piezoelectric effects. If true, even low-level electrical generation could have powered primitive lighting, perhaps using glowing gases, phosphorescent materials, or early arc effects. There is precedent. Ancient texts from various cultures describe everlasting lamps that burned without fuel. Roman historians wrote of temples illuminated for centuries without smoke. Chinese chronicles mention glowing stones that lit entire halls. These accounts are dismissed as myth. But myth often preserves distorted memories of lost technology. Another possibility lies in bioluminescence. Certain fungi, Bacteria and marine organisms emit light without heat or smoke. In nature, bioluminescence is efficient, sustained, and residue-free. Could ancient builders have cultivated glowing organisms to light enclosed spaces? It sounds improbable until we remember that ancient civilizations mastered fermentation, medicine, and chemical processes we still struggle to replicate today. The problem is not imagination. The problem is evidence. And evidence inside the pyramid has been tightly controlled. For decades, independent researchers have requested permission to conduct non-invasive tests, spectral analysis, acoustic mapping, electrical measurements. Many requests are denied. Preservation, authorities say. But preservation of what? The stone? Or the story? Even without exotic explanations, the lighting problem remains unsolved. No soot. No vents. No explanation. And the mystery deepens when we consider the precision of the interior work. The king's chamber is aligned almost perfectly with the pyramid's axis. Its granite blocks are fitted with astonishing accuracy. The ceiling beams weigh tens of tons and rest in perfect balance. Such work requires not only light, but sustained, stable illumination over long periods. Not flickering torches. Not dim reflections. Controlled light. Then there are the shafts. The narrow channels extending from the king's and queen's chambers are often called air shafts, but they do not function as ventilation. Some end blindly. Others point toward specific stars: Orion, Sirius, Thuban. Their alignment is so precise that it suggests astronomical intent. But carving these shafts posed another challenge. They are narrow, angled, and extend dozens of meters through solid stone. Workers inside would have had almost no room to move. No soot. No tool debris. No mistakes. Even modern drilling teams struggle to achieve such accuracy without guidance systems. And yet these shafts were carved thousands of years ago, if the orthodox timeline is correct. But perhaps the builders did not work in darkness at all. Perhaps the stone itself was shaped before assembly. Some researchers argue that many interior blocks were shaped and polished outside the pyramid, in open light, then placed into position. This would reduce the need for interior lighting, but not eliminate it. Final adjustments. Fine fitting. Alignment. Inspection. All require visibility. And still, no soot. Then there is the silence of the walls. In ancient Egyptian tombs, walls are covered with reliefs, texts, and spells. The Great Pyramid contains none of this. No funerary texts. No prayers. No instructions for the afterlife. Instead, it is blank. Severe. Functional. Like a machine. Machines are built to operate, not to commemorate. And machines demand precision. The more the pyramid is studied, the more it resists its assigned role as a tomb. It does not behave like one. It does not look like one. It does not contain what one should. Instead, it behaves like something else entirely. Something designed. Something intentional. Something that required light without flame, power without smoke, and knowledge without record. Which leads us to a final, uncomfortable realization. If the builders possessed a way to illuminate the interior without fire, if they could shape granite with impossible precision, if they understood resonance, geometry, and materials at an advanced level, then the Great Pyramid was not built by a primitive society climbing toward civilization. It was built by a society standing at the edge of something already mastered. And that raises a question far more dangerous than how they built it. Why did they build it? Because a machine always has a function. And in Part 6, we confront the possibility that the Great Pyramid was not meant to house the dead, but to do something else entirely. If the Great Pyramid required light without fire and precision beyond ancient tools, then its purpose can no longer be explained as a tomb. In Part 6, we examine the pyramid as a machine, and uncover clues suggesting it was designed to interact with the Earth itself. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, far beyond the reach of sunlight and beyond the assumptions of modern archaeology, the structure begins to reveal a different identity, one that does not resemble a tomb, a monument, or a symbol of royal vanity, but something far more deliberate. When you strip away the funerary narrative and observe the pyramid as an engineered object, patterns emerge that cannot be explained by ceremony or superstition alone. The pyramid's placement on the Giza plateau is not merely geographic convenience, it sits atop a geologically active limestone shelf intersected by fault lines that continuously transmit low-frequency seismic vibrations. These microtremors are not destructive earthquakes but constant pulses of planetary motion, a natural background hum of the Earth itself. Modern instruments detect these vibrations everywhere, but only in certain locations do they naturally converge and amplify, and Giza is one of those rare points. The Great Pyramid rises directly above this convergence, as if deliberately positioned to interact with the Earth's internal motion. This is not poetic language, it is measurable physics. The pyramid's mass, over 6 million tons, exerts immense pressure on the bedrock below, creating stress concentrations that convert subtle tectonic movement into mechanical vibration. In engineering, vibration is never incidental. It is either dampened to prevent failure or harnessed for function. The Great Pyramid does neither by accident. Its shape, slope, and internal geometry act together to guide vibration inward and upward simultaneously, focusing energy toward the core while maintaining structural stability. This is not how tombs are designed. This is how resonance systems behave. Inside the structure, the king's chamber functions less like a burial chamber and more like an acoustic cavity. When sound is introduced, it does not disperse randomly, it builds, sustains, and reflects with remarkable coherence. Acoustic tests conducted in recent decades have shown that the chamber resonates strongly at specific low frequencies, producing standing waves that remain stable far longer than expected in a stone room. The granite used in this chamber is not incidental decoration, it is quartz-rich material with known piezoelectric properties, meaning it generates electrical charge when subjected to pressure or vibration. Under the immense weight of the pyramid and the constant seismic input from below, the granite is perpetually stressed, perpetually vibrating at microscopic levels. In modern technology, quartz oscillators regulate time, frequency, and electrical stability. The king's chamber behaves like a massive, primitive oscillator embedded inside a stone amplifier. Surrounding this chamber are 5 relieving chambers, often described as crude structural buffers, but their design defies that simplicity. They are carefully spaced, horizontally layered, and capped with massive granite beams angled to redirect force. Instead of merely relieving weight, they distribute stress in a way that sustains resonance while preventing collapse. In effect, they tune the chamber below. This interpretation is reinforced by the fact that similar relieving structures were never replicated in later pyramids. If this was simply a trial-and-error solution, it would have evolved. Instead, it disappeared. That disappearance suggests the knowledge behind it was not preserved. The Queen's Chamber adds another layer of strangeness. Despite its name, it contains no burial, no sarcophagus, no inscriptions, and no signs of ritual use. Its niche, once thought to house a statue, displays features inconsistent with known Egyptian religious practices. The chamber resonates at different frequencies than the king's chamber, as if designed to interact with the structure in a complementary way. Then there are the shafts, narrow channels extending from both chambers, often misidentified as air vents. They are not vents. They do not facilitate airflow. Some are sealed. Others terminate abruptly. Their orientations, however, are precise, aligning with specific stellar positions as they appeared thousands of years ago. This alignment changes over time due to precession, meaning these shafts act as time-locked markers pointing to the sky of a particular era. Yet the shafts are too narrow for ritual use, too inaccessible for symbolic decoration, and too exact to be decorative. Their function appears technical rather than ceremonial, possibly serving as waveguides for sound, pressure, or electromagnetic interaction. Modern simulations conducted by physicists have demonstrated that the pyramid's geometry can concentrate electromagnetic energy within its internal chambers under certain conditions. These findings were initially dismissed as mathematical curiosities, but repeated studies confirmed that the shape itself, independent of cultural context, behaves as an energy-focusing structure. This raises an unsettling possibility that the Great Pyramid was engineered to interact not only with seismic vibration but with the Earth's electromagnetic field. The planet is enveloped in natural electromagnetic resonances, including the Schumann resonances, standing waves created between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. These frequencies overlap with the acoustic resonances measured inside the pyramid. This overlap is not random. It suggests coupling, a system designed to resonate with the planet itself. If this sounds like modern physics forced onto ancient stone, consider this: ancient civilizations across the world independently described Earth as alive, resonant, breathing. They built monuments at specific nodes: Stonehenge, Teotihuacan, Angkor Wat, all positioned on fault lines or energetic intersections. The Great Pyramid is the most extreme expression of this pattern. It is not merely aligned to the cardinal directions, it is aligned to the planet's hidden systems. Even its latitude is peculiar, matching mathematical constants related to light speed when expressed in modern units, a coincidence too precise to ignore, yet too controversial to embrace. Critics argue that this interpretation projects intention where none existed, but intention is precisely what the pyramid demands we confront. Random construction does not produce layered resonance. Symbolic burial does not require quartz-rich granite tuned to vibration. Tombs do not align with tectonic nodes. Machines do. And if the pyramid is a machine, then its silence is misleading. It has never stopped interacting with the Earth. It has never stopped responding to vibration, pressure, and time. It may no longer perform its original function, but its design still reacts to forces we barely understand. This reframes ancient Egypt itself. Rather than inventors of the pyramid, the dynastic Egyptians may have been inheritors, caretakers of a relic whose true purpose was already forgotten. They preserved it, restored it, ritualized it, and eventually claimed it. Over generations, myth replaced function, and reverence replaced understanding. The pyramid became sacred not because it was built as a tomb, but because it was incomprehensible. And incomprehensible technology often becomes divine in the hands of later cultures. The deeper this perspective is explored, the more the pyramid resists simplification. It is not one thing. It is not easily classified. It exists at the intersection of architecture, geology, physics, and forgotten knowledge. And this intersection is dangerous territory for established history. Because if the Great Pyramid was designed to interact with the Earth as a resonant system, then its builders possessed an understanding of natural forces that predates modern science by millennia. That understanding did not survive intact. It fractured. It decayed. It became myth. What remains is stone, precise, silent, patient. The pyramid does not demand belief. It demands explanation. And every explanation that confines it to a tomb fails under scrutiny. If the pyramid is a machine, then machines have purposes. They are built to do something. And that leads us to the most unsettling question of all, not how the Great Pyramid was built, but why. What function justified such precision, such scale, such permanence? What problem was so important that it required millions of tons of stone, aligned to the planet itself? Because the answer to that question does not lie in death or burial. It lies in survival, knowledge, and perhaps catastrophe. And in the next part, we will confront the possibility that the Great Pyramid was not designed to honor the past, but to protect the future. Because if ancient builders understood Earth's cycles, then they may also have understood something we still fear to face. In Part 7, we explore the idea that the Great Pyramid was built as a warning and a safeguard against a disaster humanity has already forgotten. When the Great Pyramid is approached not as a tomb or a temple but as a message encoded in stone, a disturbing pattern begins to form, one that stretches far beyond Egypt and deep into humanity's forgotten past. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the same story appears again and again, whispered through myth, legend, and sacred text, a world that existed before the present one, a world of knowledge and order, erased by a catastrophic upheaval that reshaped the Earth itself. Plato called it Atlantis, describing a powerful civilization destroyed in a single day and night of floods and earthquakes. The Sumerian spoke of antediluvian kings who ruled before a great deluge reset civilization. Hindu texts describe cyclical ages, each ending in destruction before renewal. Indigenous traditions from the Americas to Australia tell of sky fires, rising waters, and a time when humanity was nearly wiped from the earth. Modern archaeology treats these accounts as metaphor or myth, yet geology tells a parallel story written not in words but in ice, sediment, and stone. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,800 years ago, the planet experienced a sudden and violent climatic reversal known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets advanced. Sea levels fluctuated rapidly. Massive floods tore across continents as glacial meltwater was released catastrophically. Entire coastlines vanished beneath rising oceans. This was not a gradual transition, it was abrupt, global, and devastating. Human societies that had flourished along rivers and coasts would have been annihilated. Any advanced knowledge preserved in fragile materials, wood, parchment, memory, would have been erased. Only stone would remain. If a civilization existed before this event, one that understood Earth's cycles and the inevitability of catastrophe, it would have faced a terrible choice: vanish with the world, or leave behind a warning. The Great Pyramid begins to resemble such a warning. Its extreme durability, precise alignment, and monumental scale suggest it was built not for one generation, but for deep time. Its location on stable bedrock protected it from flooding. Its shape deflects seismic energy. Its mass resists erosion. Unlike coastal cities or river settlements, it would survive a planetary reset. And it did. The pyramid may not preserve texts or images because language changes and symbols fade, but mathematics endures. Geometry endures. Physics endures. The pyramid encodes ratios, alignments, and constants that transcend culture. It points to the stars not as gods, but as clocks, marking the slow wobble of Earth's axis through precession. This precessional cycle, approximately 25,920 years, was unknown to modern science until the Greeks, yet the pyramid's orientation reflects knowledge of this cycle with uncanny precision. Why would a tomb need to track cosmic time? It wouldn't. But a civilization aware of repeating global disasters might. The precessional cycle affects climate, solar radiation, and long-term planetary rhythms. If catastrophic events recur on cosmic timescales, then tracking the sky becomes a matter of survival, not religion. The Great Pyramid's alignment with Orion, often dismissed as symbolic mythology, takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Orion was associated not merely with gods, but with rebirth, resurrection, and the return after destruction. The so-called Osiris myth may be a fragmented memory of a civilization that fell and sought renewal. The pyramid does not tell the story directly, it encodes it spatially. Its internal chambers form a vertical journey from the earth to the sky, from material density to cosmic order. But unlike a temple meant for worship, access is restricted. Narrow passages. Dead ends. Hidden chambers. This is not architecture meant for crowds. It is architecture meant to endure while remaining unreadable to those unprepared to understand it. Even the absence of inscriptions becomes meaningful. Words invite interpretation. Interpretation invites distortion. Stone geometry does not argue, it waits. The more we compare the Great Pyramid to later Egyptian monuments, the clearer the rupture becomes. Later temples are ornate, symbolic, inscribed with stories and rituals. The Great Pyramid is stark, mathematical, almost industrial. It belongs to a different mindset. A mindset focused on preservation rather than expression. If the dynastic Egyptians inherited this structure, they may have mythologized it without grasping its original intent. Over time, the memory of catastrophe became religion, the memory of technology became magic, and the memory of warning became legend. This would explain why Egyptian texts speak of a first time, an age when gods ruled and knowledge flowed freely, followed by decline. It would explain why later pyramids are inferior imitations, lacking the precision and coherence of the original. It would explain why no construction records exist, because the builders were not part of recorded history. They belong to a chapter erased by flood and ice. Critics argue that such ideas flirt with fantasy, yet the alternative requires us to believe that human civilization began from scratch after the Ice Age, slowly rediscovered agriculture, astronomy, and architecture, and then somehow produced the most precise stone structure ever built, before promptly forgetting how to do it again. That version of history requires more faith than the idea of lost knowledge. The pyramid itself stands as a counter-argument. It does not look like an experiment. It looks like a conclusion. Like the final achievement of a long technological tradition, frozen in stone before annihilation. If this interpretation is correct, then the Great Pyramid is not celebrating power, it is pleading for remembrance. It is a silent attempt to bridge epochs, to pass knowledge forward across a chasm of destruction. Its builders may have known they would not survive, but hoped their message would. And perhaps it has, imperfectly. Perhaps fragments survived in myth, in scripture, in sacred geometry passed down through secret traditions. Perhaps the pyramid was meant to be rediscovered when humanity reached a certain level of understanding, capable of measuring resonance, decoding geometry, and questioning official narratives. That moment may be now. Climate instability, seismic activity, and cosmic threats once again dominate scientific concern. We are rediscovering that civilization is fragile, and that Earth operates on cycles indifferent to human ambition. The Great Pyramid has already outlived empires, religions, and languages. It will likely outlive us. And that longevity may be its most important message. Because a warning only matters if it survives long enough to be heard. The pyramid does not shout apocalypse. It does not predict dates. It simply endures, aligned to the planet and the sky, whispering that civilizations rise, fall, and rise again, and that survival depends on understanding forces beyond politics and power. If this is true, then the pyramid is not the end of a mystery, but the beginning of a responsibility. A reminder that knowledge once lost can be lost again. And that the silence of stone may be the last voice of a world that tried to warn us. But one final question remains, darker than all the others. If the builders of the Great Pyramid knew a catastrophe was coming, and if they built it to survive that catastrophe, then what did they know about the future that we still refuse to see? Because in the next part, the focus shifts from ancient warnings to modern suppression. In Part 8, we examine why access to the pyramid is so tightly controlled, why certain discoveries remain classified, and why some questions are never allowed to be asked, because the greatest threat may not be what the pyramid reveals, but what it exposes about our own civilization. If the Great Pyramid is a warning from a civilization erased by catastrophe, then its survival is no accident. In Part 8, we confront the modern mystery, why exploration is restricted, why data is hidden, and why the pyramid remains one of the most controlled structures on Earth, as if someone is afraid of what it might still reveal. In the modern world, access is power, and nowhere is that more evident than at the Great Pyramid, a structure that has survived for millennia yet is paradoxically one of the most restricted archaeological sites on Earth. While millions of tourists walk its exterior and a handful are allowed brief, guided entry into a few well-known passages, vast portions of the pyramid remain sealed, unexplored, or accessible only to select teams under strict governmental control. This restriction is often justified as preservation, but preservation alone does not explain the secrecy, the delayed publications, or the quiet suppression of anomalous findings. Over the past century, multiple expeditions using increasingly sophisticated technology, infrared thermography, muon tomography, ground-penetrating radar, acoustic mapping, have detected voids, cavities, and structural anomalies deep within the pyramid that do not correspond to any known chambers. Some of these voids are massive, rivaling the size of known rooms, yet their purpose and contents remain officially undefined. When the Scan Pyramids project announced the discovery of a large hidden void above the Grand Gallery in 2017, the world briefly paid attention, but the excitement faded quickly when authorities declined to allow physical exploration. Years passed. No robots entered. No cameras followed. The void was acknowledged, then quietly shelved. This pattern repeats again and again. Discoveries are announced cautiously, framed as technical curiosities rather than paradigm-shifting revelations, and then sealed behind layers of bureaucratic delay. Independent researchers who request access are denied. Proposals for non-invasive exploration are stalled indefinitely. The pyramid, it seems, is allowed to be admired, but not fully understood. This raises an uncomfortable question: what exactly is being protected? The stone, or the story? Throughout history, institutions have guarded narratives as fiercely as they guard territory. Egyptology, like any established field, rests on foundational assumptions about chronology, technological development, and cultural progression. The Great Pyramid sits at the center of those assumptions. If it were conclusively shown to predate dynastic Egypt, or to serve a function incompatible with a royal tomb, the ripple effects would extend far beyond archaeology. Entire timelines would need revision. The story of civilization itself would require rewriting. Funding structures, academic reputations, museum narratives, all would be destabilized. In such a context, caution can easily become suppression. There are precedents. In the early 20th century, discoveries that contradicted established human timelines, such as anomalously old tools or structures, were often dismissed, misdated, or reclassified to fit accepted frameworks. Data that does not fit is labeled outlier. Outliers are quietly ignored. The Great Pyramid, however, is too large to ignore, so its anomalies are managed instead. Consider the restrictions placed on internal measurements. High-resolution electromagnetic surveys are rarely permitted. Long-term acoustic experiments are discouraged. Even simple sampling requests are denied under the banner of conservation. Yet conservation did not prevent earlier centuries from blasting chambers open with explosives. It did not prevent casing stones from being stripped away. Preservation becomes urgent only when questions become dangerous. This tension becomes clearer when examining who controls access. Permissions flow through governmental bodies deeply intertwined with tourism, national identity, and political legitimacy. The pyramids are not just archaeological sites, they are symbols of heritage, stability, and continuity. To suggest that Egypt's most iconic monument was not built by the civilization it represents is to threaten a cornerstone of national narrative. This is not an accusation, it is a structural reality. Nations, like institutions, protect stories that unify. But truth does not always align with unity. There have been moments when cracks appeared. In the 1990s, robotic exploration of the pyramid's southern shaft revealed a small stone door with copper handles. This discovery stunned researchers, as it implied intentional sealing, not ventilation. Years later, a second robot drilled through the door only to reveal another sealed barrier behind it. A door behind a door. The implication was clear: something was meant to remain inaccessible. Yet after this discovery, exploration slowed dramatically. Public updates became vague. Interest waned. No clear explanation was offered for what lay beyond. Other anomalies followed. Thermal imaging revealed unexplained heat patterns at the pyramid's base, suggesting internal voids or energy differentials. These findings were briefly publicized, then buried beneath technical language and silence. When independent engineers attempted to analyze available data, they were dismissed as fringe. Yet their conclusions often mirrored what official teams quietly acknowledged but refused to pursue. The pattern is not one of conspiracy in the cinematic sense, but of institutional inertia combined with fear of disruption. Revolutionary discoveries demand revolutionary explanations, and those threaten stability. It is safer to study the pyramid as architecture than as technology. Safer to frame anomalies as errors than as evidence. Safer to limit access than to risk revelation. But history shows that suppression rarely holds forever. Truth has a way of resurfacing, often when technology advances beyond the ability to contain it. Satellite imaging, open-source data analysis, and independent modeling now allow researchers outside official channels to test hypotheses that were once impossible. The pyramid is increasingly being studied not as a cultural artifact, but as a physical system subject to universal laws. And universal laws do not care about academic consensus. If the Great Pyramid interacts with seismic, acoustic, or electromagnetic forces, then those interactions can be measured, modeled, and eventually understood, whether permission is granted or not. This may explain the increasing urgency around controlling narrative rather than data. Because data, once released, cannot be unreleased. The irony is that the pyramid itself was built to survive time, not secrecy. If it was meant as a message, then control delays understanding but cannot prevent it. The structure does not decay at the pace of political caution. It waits. And waiting may be the most unsettling aspect of all. The pyramid does not need defenders. It does not need interpreters. It needs only observers willing to ask forbidden questions. And those questions are becoming harder to silence as evidence accumulates. Why are certain chambers off limits? Why are discoveries announced without follow-up? Why does the simplest explanation, tomb, require so many exceptions, while the more complex explanation, function, fits the evidence more cleanly? At some point, resistance itself becomes suspicious. And that suspicion leads to a final, unavoidable realization: if the Great Pyramid truly contains knowledge capable of altering our understanding of history and civilization, then the greatest mystery is not ancient, it is modern. It is about why, in an age of information, the most studied structure on Earth remains fundamentally unexplored. Because perhaps the pyramid does not merely challenge the past. Perhaps it challenges the present. And perhaps what it reveals would force us to confront not only who we were, but who we are becoming. Which leads to the final and most dangerous question of all. If the Great Pyramid is a warning, and if modern society is actively limiting access to that warning, then what are we afraid of remembering? Because in the final part, we will confront the ultimate implication that the pyramid's message may not be about what already happened, but about what is coming next. And if that is true, then the silence surrounding it is not preservation. It is denial. If access to the Great Pyramid is controlled not to protect stone but to protect a story. If the Great Pyramid is approached not as a relic of the past but as an instrument calibrated for the future, then its true significance begins to feel uncomfortably immediate, because everything about it suggests anticipation rather than commemoration, foresight rather than memory. The pyramid does not celebrate a king, a dynasty, or even a civilization. It prepares for a moment, one defined not by human calendars but by planetary cycles that unfold over tens of thousands of years. Earth is not static, and ancient builders, whoever they were, appear to have understood this with terrifying clarity. The planet moves through repeating rhythms governed by precession, axial tilt, solar output, and gravitational interactions with the moon and other celestial bodies, rhythms that modern science is only beginning to fully model. These cycles influence climate stability, ocean circulation, seismic stress, and even the strength of Earth's magnetic field. Geological records show that mass extinctions, abrupt climate shifts, and geomagnetic excursions do not occur randomly, they cluster around certain thresholds in these long cycles. Ice cores, sediment layers, and fossil records all point to moments when Earth changed violently and quickly, catching life unprepared. If an advanced prehistoric civilization witnessed one of these transitions, they may have realized that survival depended not on dominance, but on prediction. And prediction requires markers, structures that outlast memory, technology, and culture. The Great Pyramid may be such a marker. Its alignment to true north is not merely impressive, it is unnervingly precise, even by modern standards, suggesting an intimate understanding of Earth's rotational axis. Yet that axis is not fixed. It slowly wobbles over time, tracing a circle in the sky every 25,920 years, a motion known as axial precession. The pyramid appears to encode awareness of this cycle, pointing not only to stars but to the slow drift of the heavens themselves. This is crucial, because precession is not cosmetic, it alters how solar radiation is distributed across the planet, influencing glacial cycles, monsoons, and long-term climate stability. When precession aligns with other factors, the result can be catastrophic. The Younger Dryas may have been one such alignment. If the builders of the pyramid survived or inherited knowledge from that era, they may have understood that another convergence would come again. Not tomorrow, not next century, but inevitably. The pyramid's message, then, would not be a warning with a date, but a warning with a condition. A reminder that Earth resets when certain thresholds are crossed, regardless of who rules or what technology exists. This perspective casts modern civilization in an unsettling light. We see ourselves as advanced, secure, insulated by science and infrastructure, yet we are more globally interconnected and environmentally dependent than any civilization before us. Our cities cluster along coasts. Our food systems rely on climate stability. Our power grids depend on magnetic consistency. A significant geomagnetic disruption, rapid sea level rise, or abrupt climate shift would not take centuries to unravel society, it would take months. The irony is that while we monitor these risks with satellites and supercomputers, we often dismiss ancient warnings because they lack modern language. But the pyramid does not speak in myths or prophesize. It speaks in endurance. It says, without words, that civilizations capable of incredible precision can still fall, and that knowledge, if not preserved properly, can vanish entirely. It suggests that survival is not guaranteed by progress, but by humility before planetary forces. The final implication is deeply uncomfortable. The Great Pyramid may have been built not to prevent catastrophe, but to ensure that something remains after it. A reference point. A baseline. A reminder carved into stone that says, we were here. We understood. Learn faster than we did. This would explain why the structure does not provide explicit instructions. Instructions assume continuity. The pyramid assumes collapse. It waits for rediscovery by a civilization capable of asking the right questions again. Perhaps that civilization is ours. Perhaps the recent surge in interest, the anomalies detected by modern instruments, the renewed debate over timelines and lost knowledge, are not coincidences but symptoms of readiness. Not readiness to decode every secret, but readiness to accept that history is not linear and that humanity is not immune to reset. The pyramid's silence becomes its final lesson. It does not beg, threaten, or persuade. It simply exists, aligned to earth and sky, indifferent to whether we listen. And that indifference may be the most chilling message of all. Because if the builders understood the cycles, they may also have understood that warning alone does not guarantee survival. Some civilizations hear the message. Others ignore it. The pyramid cannot choose for us. It can only endure long enough to be noticed again. And now that we are noticing, now that we are measuring, questioning, and doubting, the responsibility shifts from the past to the present. The Great Pyramid no longer belongs to ancient history, it belongs to our moment. It asks a single, silent question: what will you do with the knowledge that everything you have built is temporary? Will we treat the pyramid as a curiosity, a tourist destination, a solved puzzle with an unsatisfying answer? Or will we recognize it as what it may truly be, a surviving voice from a lost world, telling us that intelligence alone is not enough, that technology without wisdom still ends in ruin, and that Earth does not negotiate? The future will answer that question, not with words, but with consequences. And when that answer comes, the Great Pyramid will still be there, just as it has been through ice ages, floods, empires, and extinction events, waiting to be understood by whoever comes next. Because the pyramid was never built for the past. It was built for the survivors.